Better Call Saul is one of the greatest shows of all time, not because of its cinematography or its acting or even its script, although these are all top class. Instead, it's because as a complete package, it gives the audience the most clear and deep view of morality that's ever been seen on TV. Jimmy McGill's journey, masterfully portrayed by Bob Odenkirk, is one of struggle, empathy, mistakes, and finally, atonement. It beautifully portrays one man's battle with a rigged system and the dark path that sent him down, and it couldn't have come at a better time. Today, as the odds for the little guy in our world get worse every day, we can all empathize with Jimmy. When lots of us saw the first season of Better Call Saul, we were disappointed. It was excellent, of course, beautifully scripted, engaging and visually stunning, as we'd come to expect with the Breaking Bad universe. But it was also slower, more focused, and by the time the first season was over, it didn't really feel like we were really that much closer to seeing Saul Goodman. Instead of the charismatic and sleazy character we'd grown to love, Jimmy McGill felt entirely different. It wouldn't be until the very end of season 4 that Saul Goodman would finally emerge, but by that point, we were all along for the ride anyway. Saul was just one part of possibly the best character study in the history of television. From what we've seen, Jimmy's struggle in the division within him began incredibly early in his life. We see his childhood at his father's shop, and the very beginning of the problem that would follow him for the rest of his life. While slacking off from his work, he sees a man walk into the shop and blatantly scam his father.
If you could possibly just spare $5 instead, I'd rather grab a cab than take a chance with my old clunker.
Who's too kind and naive to realize it. Then when Jimmy's dad goes off to chase down the guy, Jimmy is left all alone with the register. Here there's an opportunity for him to profit from his father's trust, and he takes it. Chronologically, it's the first time we see Jimmy's reaction to a moral choice, and at the time, it's an easy choice for Jimmy to make. He's got two options as personified by the two other people in the scene.
There are wolves and sheep in this world, kid. Figure out which one you're gonna be.
Either he can be a sheep like his dad, an honest, if unassuming man who's constantly being taken advantage of, or he can be a wolf, like the handsome scam artist he just met, the only winner in this entire situation. We're often given the same choice in life, whether to play by the rules or cheat to get ahead. It's not an easy one to make. Everywhere around us, the top of our society cheat and lie and steal without repercussions, and most of these people higher up in the system get off easily. Just one banker was arrested for the 2008 financial crash, the fallout of which made billions of lives worse. The same was true with the COVID-19 pandemic and our current economic crisis. The rich get fined, the poor get jail time. So what reason is there to follow the rules in the first place? Well, Better Call Saul never directly gives us that answer, but it does give us a pretty good example of what can happen if you don't. We learn later on that Jimmy kept stealing money from his dad's shop. Over time it amounts to thousands of dollars, enough to put the shop out of business. Jimmy's dad just died 6 months later, and once Jimmy's brother Chuck learns about Jimmy's theft, he never forgave him. Duality is everywhere in Better Call Saul, and it's most obvious in Jimmy's relationship with his brother Chuck. After their childhood, the two men carved out their own paths in life. Chuck pursued a career as a lawyer and started his own firm. Meanwhile, Jimmy went off the rails and got deep into scams, scratching out a living where he could. The two men are incredibly similar, whilst also being complete opposites. They're both excellent at their chosen careers. Chuck is a legal prodigy and a world-famous lawyer, whilst Jimmy is a master of charisma, manipulation, and persuasion. Where they differ is in their view on law and morality. Whilst he's not blind like their father, Chuck reveres the legal system like a deity, and he's as straight as an arrow. While he might not be morally sound, he always stays within the law. As ethics go, he represents what's called deontology. Every action for deontologists is good or bad based on the action itself. Killing and stealing are morally bad regardless of the context or the intentions. But as an extension, Chuck sees people in the same way, clearly defined and categorized based on their actions without any room for change. Jimmy is the opposite. Despite having a good heart, he's always been drawn to the other side. He's also a pragmatist. If doing something is against the law but leads to a better outcome, then Jimmy will find a way to do it. It's called consequentialism, basing your actions solely on the consequences of the decision. This conflict, both between Jimmy and his brother, as well as Jimmy and himself, are what's going to drive the rest of this journey. But beyond this, the two characters are allegories for the system and the natural urge to fight against it. Chuck is both a member of the establishment and a representation of it. He holds its laws up above everything else, and he strongly believes in its hierarchy. It's not that he's classist or looks down on people based on wealth, although he is pretty awkward with normal people. His view of people is more based on a judgment on their underlying character. It's why, despite the fact that Jimmy is hardworking, clearly skilled, and his own blood, he never loses his picture of him as lesser. We don't ever see the moment that that Chuck solidified his judgment of Jimmy, but we do see the first time he pretends to forgive him. Chuck was right in the end, but it's likely that it was his own actions that turned his judgment of his brother into a self-fulfilling prophecy. To borrow a phrase from the show, Jimmy's bad choice road began when he first stole from his dad's shop. The same thrill he got from that action, the mix of guilt and triumph, was like an addiction for him. In his mind, just like all of us, he can only see the immediate consequences of his actions. Each misdeed is justifiable as just a little further, but unforeseen circumstances and the chaos of the world slowly pull Jimmy further away from the light. Jimmy finally gets caught and comes up against a brick wall. His brother comes to see him, and it's clear they've gone through this before. But instead of just bailing him out, like his father would have, Chuck makes a deal with Jimmy. He has to leave his life behind, go straight and get a job at his brother's company. In return, Chuck will let Jimmy off of the hook. And so of course, Jimmy takes the deal. It's the first time Jimmy has to actually deal with the consequences of his actions. But he does the right thing. He leaves it all behind and puts in years of work in the mailroom, whilst also studying for and passing the bar. It also eventually leads him to Kim, the love of his life. It was this act of kindness from his brother that gave Jimmy a new life. But it wasn't just a pivotal moment for Jimmy, it set in stone who he was to Chuck. Chuck would never actually forgive him for his crimes, or for anything that he did. This picture of Jimmy as a scammer and a conman would never change for Chuck. After this, Jimmy works tirelessly to try and gain the approval of both Chuck and the system he represents. In the first season, we see him working as a criminal defense lawyer, pouring his heart and soul into an unforgiving but morally valuable job. Even after years of this, while also caring for Chuck and his illness, Jimmy isn't rewarded for his hard work. The resentment from this is why Jimmy starts backsliding into his old tricks again. If he hadn't gotten involved with the skaters and their scam,
what can I do to make it right?
$500.
$500? Listen, Starlight Express, I'm gonna give you a 9.6 for technique, 0.0 for choice of victim. I'm a lawyer.
he would never have met Tuco or Nacho, or even have gotten involved with the cartel in the first place. But it was this bad choice amongst others that set his course for the future. But even without that fateful decision to pick up scamming again, the system was always rigged against him. In season 1, Howard is portrayed as the villain. He's easy to hate, with his perfect smile and establishment background. But later it's revealed that it was actually Chuck who was behind Jimmy's shunning from his brother's law firm. Despite giving him the illusion of a second chance, Chuck and the system he represents never had any intention of letting him move up in society. From his first mistakes as a child, his place lower down on the ladder was laid in stone for people like Chuck. We see the same thing happening today. It's not that there shouldn't be criminal records, but simply being an ex-criminal shuts so many doors in life, trapping people and keeping them down. Even if your mistake wasn't a crime though, the internet and smartphones means that someone was probably filming it. Once it's online, it's almost impossible to erase. For tons of people, possibly the worst moment of their life is the first result on Google for their name. Even if it hasn't been proved yet, the merciless courts of public opinion is always ready to tear people down. This move by Chuck though is the key betrayal of the show, and it confirms Jimmy's feelings and his decision to fight back. Jimmy, in his own mind, has always existed outside of the establishment. He's always been an outsider. For nearly all of the show, he believes that the system has treated him unfairly, and that people like him without a spotless record will always be pushed to the side. When Chuck betrays him, it only confirms this in his mind.
You called him. You called Hamlin. I always turn my phone off before I put it in your mailbox. It was left on, battery drained. I was so damn sure that I turned it off, because I always do. It's a habit, right? So I called the phone company. Turns out there was a deleted call. And you know whose number? Hamlin's.
And so he sets out to destroy both Chuck and the system he represents. One scene that illuminates this attitude is his reaction to being put on the scholarship board. When they overlook one of the applicants because of some minor mistakes years before, he gets enraged. He corners the failing applicant and unloads his whole philosophy on her.
They'll pat you on the head, but they are never, ever letting you in.
Like he's talking to his younger self rather than someone else. It's because of this resentment that Jimmy has a strong need to subvert it and cheat it whenever he can. Even when he's grinding away and trying to play within the rules, he takes every opportunity he can. His repeated refusal to get the right stickers for the parking lot at the courthouse is a great example of this. Rather than just getting the stickers, he tries to convince Mike to let him off.
Now you either pay the $3 or you go back inside and you get an additional sticker. Son of a bitch.
It never works, but he keeps trying just to chase that feeling. It helps that playing it straight is boring for Jimmy, whose trained eye is doubtlessly always seeing potential marks and schemes to pull off. It goes so far that the adrenaline of the job and the satisfaction afterwards are bigger rewards than the actual prize itself. It's not that this is the only thing driving Jimmy though. He's still got a moral compass and his consciousness intervenes from time to time. When Jimmy finally learns of Chuck's betrayal though, it's the final nail in the coffin for his life within the system. It broke his resistance to the drudgery and the constant struggle for little returns. Even though he's finally gotten what he wants, it doesn't matter anymore. Despite landing a prestigious job and after years of work, Jimmy is desperate to quit. He goes back to his old tricks, slowly getting more involved in the seedy underworld he left behind. But at this point, the momentum of his previous actions is enough anyway. The opening to episode 6 of season 2 is key. Jimmy's longing to get back to the world he knows, so instead of sleeping in his new fancy apartment, he goes straight back to sleeping on the folding spring bed in his cupboard at the nail salon. Just like Walter White, Jimmy is an expert at his craft, and after the betrayal, he turns it all on Chuck. He systematically destroys everything he loves, ending with taking the law out of his hands and humiliating him in front of everyone he knows.
Take away from the fact that the defendant...
am not crazy! I am not crazy.
Chuck's outburst in the courtroom, like a lot of memes, isn't just famous because it's funny, it's the final release of decades of resentment, of his true feelings towards Jimmy and people like him.
He's done worse. Are you telling me that a man just happens to fall like that? No, he orchestrated it. Jimmy.
Not long after, with his life in tatters, Chuck does the unthinkable. And if Chuck's betrayal doomed Jimmy to a life of crime, his death pushed him even further in. Jimmy completely breaks down, torn between his grief, his regrets, and his ever-present anger and resentment. It's at this point that Jimmy begins to detach from himself. In an attempt to escape from his life, he takes on the Saul Goodman persona. As if he's trying to prove himself that Jimmy McGill is really dead, Saul's first act is to use Jimmy's sincere emotions and feelings as a scam to get his legal license back. From then on, the bad choice road keeps going, and Jimmy gets sucked in even deeper. Now let's take a step back from this and really think about the bad choice road. As highlighted in the show, your actions can have far-reaching and unforeseeable consequences. Ethics often deals with isolated situations. Do you pull the lever to save 5 people at the cost of one person's life? But none of the moral choices that we actually make are like this. The circumstances are complex. We rarely know the full details, and what seems like the right choice, or even a less bad option, can end in tragedy. Jimmy learns this the hard way again and again throughout the show. Being a pragmatist and only thinking about the consequences rather than the laws, he goes further and further. But once you're on the road, getting off is always far more destructive and harmful than just carrying on and dealing with the moment at hand. But in Chuck, we see how doing the opposite doesn't work well either. Following some strict code of laws at all times doesn't necessarily mean you'll always do the right thing. Tons of awful acts, like stringing along and betraying your own brother, aren't prohibited by the law, and as we see in Chuck himself and in other authority figures, the people writing the laws are often corrupt or vicious themselves. And when the society that those laws upheld is corrupt as well, it gives you all the more reason to break them occasionally. Real life is far too complex for any hard moral code to always result in the best possible choice. Even in some of the earliest works on ethics and justice, this truth was always acknowledged. Aristotle once said that it is sometimes better to be equatable to your fellow man rather than to follow the law to the letter. So if basing your actions on the specific situation doesn't work all the time, and basing them on strict laws doesn't work either, then what should you do? Well, it's not a question that Jimmy's going to be able to answer for a while, as he gets more detached from himself and drifts further and further away from the light as the show goes on, pulling all the people around him along with him. Kim is one of these people. At first she's hesitant to get involved with Jimmy's scams, but after a small scheme, she becomes more and more involved and more addicted to the lifestyle. Eventually, she even starts going further than Jimmy. She throws her life away within the system to follow through on their most destructive and vengeful plan yet. Howard becomes the first of many true victims, losing his life just by getting caught up in Jimmy's world. Kim checks out completely, moving away and creating a dull life without any decisions to make whatsoever. She loses her faith in her ability to see right from wrong. Jimmy does the same thing in a different way, continuing to immerse himself more in the Saul Goodman persona. Over the course of Breaking Bad, Bad Choice Road continues on and he gets more and more detached. Eventually, he has to completely abandon his life altogether and he becomes Gene. This life is even more empty for Saul, and for years it crushes him to live like this. Eventually, just like before, gets involved in his old tricks, and again, just like before, it all blows up in his face. Throughout the entire show, Jimmy never actually kills anyone himself. He's complicit in murders, but doesn't do the act himself. But when he gets caught again by an old woman he conned, there comes yet another opportunity for him to keep going down the bad choice road. He could kill her so she can't reveal his identity, or he can let her go and face the consequences. Jimmy finally chooses to let her go, and it ends in his capture. For how far gone Jimmy is at this point, this isn't really an unexpected turn. He goes from scamming cancer patients to finally making the right choice. But at first it looks like he's just finally found the line he won't cross. Jimmy dips back into his legal expertise and gets to work. For the crimes that they've uncovered, he's looking at a life sentence plus 190 years, but Jimmy's been playing the system for years now, so long that he turns a life behind bars into just 7 years. The prosecution knows that they can't let Jimmy in front of a jury, or he could torpedo the whole case with his charisma and skills in persuasion. He even gets them to make sure he'll serve his time at the cushiest prison in the country. But just as his schemes are going into motion, Jimmy does a complete 180. He confesses to everything despite his plea bargain.
I kept Walter White out of jail. I laundered his money, I lied for him, and I made millions.
Throwing the whole deal out of the window. And in the final scene of the show, we see Jimmy talking to Kim for one last time, where he gets 86 years for his truthful confession. It almost goes unnoticed that playing the system and being completely remorseless would have gotten Jimmy way further than actually just telling the truth. But even if he did just 7 years, it would have doomed him to a life on the bad choice road. In owning up to all of his crimes, even the ones that aren't against the law, Jimmy finally becomes his authentic self. It was his way of getting off of the bad choice road and reconnecting with the part of himself he tried to destroy. Both the Saul persona and the Gene persona were ways to escape from his past crimes, to bury his head in the sand and pretend they never happened. And by confessing to all of it and going back to his original name, he's at least beginning to atone for his actions. Despite being in prison, Jimmy's among the people he helped and worked with for decades. They treat him with respect and fist bump him in the hallways. We see him working in the kitchen, a job that's often well respected in prisoners. It isn't a coincidence that Jimmy becoming himself again happened at the same time as him doing the right thing. The right moral choice doesn't come from sets of laws or individual situations as we've seen. Instead, they come out of your own experience, your own moral compass, and your own ability to see right from wrong. These are things not gained through reading, but through experience. And as Better Call Saul shows, you don't need to get things right all the time. Even Jimmy, with his long list of sins, eventually finds the right thing to do. Afterwards, as his authentic self, he's finally at peace.